So go ahead and get started. Just a reminder, your midterm exam is due tonight by 11:59 p.m. in Blackboard. Preferably in a Word doc or PDF file. Those are the easiest to open. So just make sure I have your midterm by 11:59 p.m. tonight. Any questions on that? No? Everyone's good? Okay. All right. So we are going to go ahead and get started on Chapter 9. Do you have your mask? Yeah, that's okay. I know, it's hard to remember sometimes. Okay, so we talked last time about participation, who participates, who doesn't, etc. Now we're going to start talking about the parties. Not the fun kind with tequila, unfortunately, but the political parties. So we're going to talk about why they exist, how they've changed over time, and basically some of the issues we see with the two-party system. Okay, so what exactly are parties? They're organizations that exist to try and influence government. And they try to control the government by nominating candidates and getting them elected to office, right? Joe Biden wants to become president. So he is the Democratic Party's nominee, and if he wins, he'll get to shape policy for the next 4 years. So essentially, they're the organization that runs the people who hope to run the government. And there is a bit of partisanship that we see. There is a fair number of people who do identify with one of the two major parties, who will identify as Democrat or Republican. And it frames how you look at the parties. If you're a Democrat, you're probably not too happy with President Trump, and if you're a Republican, you probably maybe don't like Joe Biden that much. And they are the point of contact. If we don't like who's in charge, we can pick to put the other party in power. If on November 3rd the voters say, you know what, President Trump needs to be a one-term president, time for him to go, then they can say that, right? They can choose to remove him from office. So it's our way of having an influence on the government by saying, we don't want this person in office anymore. We don't want this group in charge. And we do need competitive parties, right? If we had a one-party system, then elections would be not pointless, but damn near, right? There wouldn't be any real excitement or animation over it. So we do need competitive, responsible parties so we have an actual choice in who is running the country. But they do need to be competitive. If it's not competitive, then why bother to show up to vote, all right? So we need parties to help give us a real choice. So they are another necessary evil. The downside of parties are that they are very polarized, and because of the amount of money they need to raise, they do tend to focus too much on what interest groups want and what affluent groups want, and not what the majority of the American people want. Okay, so our parties have shifted significantly over time. And part of the reason that happens is because of both internal, meaning within the party, and external mobilization. Internal mobilization is when there's something like an economic crisis or a war that causes the party in power to kind of shift in a different direction, to try to seek popular support by moving away from each other. So internal fracturing, for example, was the rise of the Tea Party within the Republican Party in 2010. They thought the party wasn't conservative enough, so they kind of formed their own movement and kind of moved away from that identity. External is where the party that's not in power tries to get the people to vote them back into power. So the Republican Party was created because of the anti-slavery movement. It's one thing to protest inequality, it's another thing to form a movement within a party to push to address inequality. The Republican Party got its start in the abolition movement. But here in the US, even though we do have multiple parties, it really is a two-party system. The only candidates who ever really have a chance to win are Republicans or Democrats. And there's, of course, a variety of problems with this that we'll talk about later, but it doesn't help that Bernie Sanders has to run as a Democrat to have a chance to win when he's not, technically speaking, a Democrat. He's a social democrat. It's a different identity. And it also doesn't help that it's a winner-take-all system. That basically the first person to get the most votes wins. It's not a majority system. You do not have to get the majority of the votes. You just have to get the most votes. So a candidate can win office with 40% of the popular vote because he or she got the most votes. So it's not a majority system. We do not pick a winner based on who gets the majority of the vote. It's who gets the most votes. And that is very problematic, of course. And it doesn't help. It limits our choices, right? If we have two candidates that nobody likes, then people don't show up to vote because they're discouraged from voting third party. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were the two most disliked candidates in modern history. What do you do when that happens, right? If you're a voter and you don't like either of the two-party candidates, what are your choices? You could vote third party, but it's not really going to make a difference. Or you could choose not to vote. And in 2016, people chose not to vote. Okay, so we have a two-party system, and the parties have to get people to run on every level. You need candidates on the local, the state, and the national level. And usually they'll pick the candidate, they'll try to get candidates who are loyal to the party platform and the party's ideological base. You don't necessarily want a pro-choice Republican running in Indiana or Alabama. And sometimes the party leadership will try to find a candidate to run. They want people who have a strong leadership record, some name recognition, and most importantly, the ability to raise money. If you can't raise your own money, the party's not going to want to back you, because there's so many elections that need money that if they have to spend millions of dollars helping you out, that's millions of dollars that can't go to another race. So they look for people who are ideologically loyal, strong leadership skills, and able to raise the money. But there are problems with getting people to run. People don't necessarily want to run the gamut of all of the scrutiny they get, all of the opposition research. You probably wouldn't want to run for office if someone is like, if you run for office, we'll reveal that you cheated on your 8th grade test, right? Or that you used to be a drug addict, or you have a problem with speeding. So unfortunately, because of the scrutiny, some candidates just end up choosing not to run altogether. And money does play an important role in the elections. To run for the House of Representatives, you're talking a minimum of $600,000, $700,000, and that's for a non-competitive race. For Senate, we're talking maybe $50, $60 million easily. Maybe a little less, but if it's competitive, you're going to have to spend a lot of money. And if you're going to run for president, you'd better have some very generous donors. In 2012, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney spent $4 billion on the presidential election. That's more than the GDP of some countries. I mean, we're talking huge amounts of money going into politics. So you got to be able to raise the money. You got to be able to stomach the opposition, and you got to be someone who can get the voters to show up. So that can be tricky, trying to get people, especially on the local level. Seats like city council and school board aren't necessarily the sexy, glamorous seats, but you got to have someone to run for that seat. So it can be difficult to find people willing to run for office. Also, you want to be careful if you go after your opponent to make sure they can't come back after you. When Barack Obama was running for Senate in 2004, his Republican opponent was a man named Jack Ryan, who hired a guy to follow Obama everywhere he went and film him. Now, that's not a problem for rallies because that's opposition research, but he was filming him with his kids outside his home. It crossed the line. And then it turned out that Jack Ryan had been accused by his ex-wife of domestic violence, amongst other charges, and he ended up having to drop out of the race. So you want to be careful with that, right? Because if he hadn't been stupid about going too hard after Obama, he might not have been scrutinized that hard in return. It's a pretty stupid move on his part. Okay, so ideally, you don't want more than one Democrat or Republican candidate running in a general election, right? You don't want two Democrats running for a House seat or two Republicans, because it's going to split the vote and give the other party the victory. It's kind of like the Oscars, right? When they nominate two or three people from the same movie in the same category, the odds of that person winning go down. So they're only going to want one candidate in a general election per seat. Obviously, there is the primary and the caucus that gets used. Some of you saw the Iowa caucus earlier this year and its unmitigated disaster with the app that failed and the problems. Most states use a primary. It's quicker, it's more secure, it's private. But one way or the other, you have to pick someone to be your party's nominee. Out of 5 people running for Senate, amongst the Democrats, you can only pick one, right? So that's the point of the primary, is to pick that one person who's going to run for that one position. Candidates do need party backing, especially on the national level. So in that case, they do tend to be very ideologically rigid. A Republican may not say that they're pro-choice just because they don't want to deal with the problems from the party. A Democrat may not want to say, I don't support gay marriage, because that's not the attitude of the party. So they're careful about what they say to make sure that the party endorses them and helps them raise the money. And then, of course, you get Democrats and Republicans using voter mobilization, working with nonprofits like the League of Women Voters, community groups, and others to get people out to vote, organizing transportation from senior care facilities to the polls, going into neighborhoods that are relatively low income and saying, we can take you to the polls, offering to help voters show up on election day. Right? It's one thing to get people to say they support your candidate. It's another thing to get them to show up on election day. So they're going to call, email, text, drop off flyers, show up at your door, to try and make sure you show up to vote. And so there's a little over 240 million potential voters, and the parties will look at data like voter registration, the census information, and consumer behavior to try and target voters. Where do we want to spend the money? What's important in this area? That kind of thing. And we do see micro-targeting. Inevitably, in a campaign, there will be this one specific group that the candidates focus on for some reason. In 2004, it was the so-called soccer mom. The mom with her minivan, her 2.5 kids, the dog, the whole 9 yards. And so they're focusing on her to talk about safety and security, right? 3 years after 9/11, both parties were focused on how do we prevent terrorism? How do we make people feel safe? So they're reaching out to these suburban moms, trying to appeal to them to get their vote. This time around, it's not super clear which group they're focusing on. Democrats are trying to focus a bit more on minority candidates, and it looks like the Republicans are kind of focusing on the Rust Belt vote. But inevitably, they'll pick a group and say, this group could make a difference in the outcome of the election, let's go target them. And in 2024, if Texas is a swing state like they're thinking it might be this year, you better bet both parties are going to go after the Hispanic and Latino vote in Texas. They might actually come down to the Rio Grande Valley for a change. Wouldn't that be nice? Okay. For the presidential elections, every 4 years, the Democrat and Republican parties will host a national convention. This year, obviously, because of COVID, it couldn't be in person. But usually, they will pick a city and hold their convention. The Democratic convention was supposed to be in Milwaukee this year, obviously not, right? They try not to schedule the conventions to be in the same city, both conventions, because that's just too much of a hassle. So they'll rotate. They'll go to Chicago, or Houston, or Tampa, or Milwaukee. And this is where the presidential candidate is formally nominated. Also the vice presidential candidate. This is where they say Donald Trump is the Republican nominee. Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee. If there's any changes to the party platform, that also gets brought up at the convention. Now, prior to World War II, usually it was at the convention that we knew who the nominee was going to be, because there weren't the use of primaries as much. So there would be days of debate, horse trading, compromises. And now, because of primaries and caucuses, we know who the nominee is prior to the convention. It's extremely rare to have what's called a brokered convention, where no candidate has enough delegates to be the nominee. That almost happened in 2016, and it didn't. It's not impossible, it's just pretty rare these days. So we do see some outlining of the party's positions on issues like abortion or same-sex marriage, but for the most part, the platform's just there. The nominees don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to it, and the voters don't necessarily care either. So conventions can be fairly routine, somewhat boring for people who aren't interested in politics. Usually the most excitement we see at a convention is who's going to be the VP nominee. Usually the presidential candidate doesn't announce until about a week before the convention, right? Because they want all that build up, that excitement. So it doesn't usually get contentious. But there is an example of a convention that got very, very ugly, and that was the Democratic National Convention in 1968. In 1968, there were three men running for president. Robert Kennedy, who was the brother of President John F. Kennedy, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and Senator Eugene McCarthy. Bobby Kennedy was in the lead, and on the night of the California primary, he was shot and killed in his hotel. So now the party's presumptive nominee is dead. And I'm not saying this lightly, it was a major problem, right? So what do you do when your party's presumptive nominee has died? So then it got into this huge fight at the convention. Some of the delegates said, let's give it to Ted Kennedy to run in his brother's place. Others said, no, Eugene McCarthy, because he had the second most votes behind Kennedy. And the third group said, let's just give it to the vice president because that makes the most sense. On top of that, there was a lot of anti-war protest outside the convention in Chicago that led to huge instances of violence, riots, and a bloody, bloody, bloody mess. So I'm going to show you a video, a brief clip from the 1968 Democratic Convention in its horrifically bad glory.
Members of the Youth International Party, Yippies, they called themselves, converged on Chicago. They said they were there to protest the war, poverty, racism, and other social ills. Some of them were also determined to provoke a confrontation, to draw attention from the convention to the streets. Mayor Richard Daley vowed to keep it peaceful, even if it took force to keep the peace. He was backed by 12,000 police, 5,000 National Guardsmen, 7,500 regular Army troops. Hundreds of marchers and dozens of policemen were injured. Restraint was absent on both sides. This was later called a police riot. During that frightful week, the demonstrators repeatedly tried to march on the site of the convention, the stockyards. Repeatedly, they were forced back. But even inside the convention hall, the virus of violence is pervasive. Dan Raddick and Walter Cronkite of CBS News.
Take your hands off of me. Dan Raddick. Unless you're here to arrest me, don't push me, please.
Okay, so obviously not the ideal convention. And it cost the Democrats the election because the Republicans were better organized. They didn't have the violence and the nastiness. But usually it's not like that. Usually it's calm, it's civil, it's not something a lot of voters pay attention to necessarily. Okay, so both parties have to have a committee that does a lot of the important work, trying to raise money for candidates, trying to resolve a dispute within the party, working with the media to put their message forward. They also have to deal with issues involving money. Now, there's money that's given to parties that's hard money and soft money. Soft money is given to the parties and it's not well regulated. Hard money is when you donate directly to a candidate. Soft money is when you give it to the party. So basically this isn't well regulated. The way the committees set it up so they can spend and raise a ton of money is to use what's called a political action committee, or a PAC. And nowadays we have what's called a super PAC. These are made up of what are called 527 committees, and essentially they can raise and spend as much money as they want, as long as they don't directly coordinate their actions with the party. So this is where we see the ads like Citizens Against Donald Trump, or the National Rifle Association running those ads that say not affiliated with any party. And so as long as they're not coordinating their actions with the party, they can spend the money as much as they want. There's also a 501c4. These are politically active, non-profit groups. So you could set up a 501c4 and say the purpose of this nonprofit is to increase voter registration. Okay, and as long as the primary purpose of this nonprofit is not to spend money on campaigns, then they can spend as much as they want. This is called dark money. Because they are considered a non-profit, they are not required by law to disclose who donates and how much. So we don't actually know how much money these 501c4s raise or spend, because they are not required by law to disclose this. The majority of the money that goes into elections are either soft money or dark money. And there's not as much accountability on the money as we might like to see. Okay, any questions? Okay. All right. So you've got the national parties, but then, of course, you also have to have state and local parties. And through the 19th and early 20th centuries, on this local level, it was basically a very small group of people who controlled the parties. Party machines were famous in cities like Chicago, Boston, and New York City. They did have pretty close ties to the mob. They were pretty closely tied to neighborhood organizations. And so they would basically give you something in exchange for your vote. They would say, if you vote for our candidate, we'll help you get a job as a firefighter, police officer, or sanitation worker, which were very highly paid jobs at the time. Or we'll help you get citizenship. Even something as simple as, we'll give you a turkey for Thanksgiving if you vote. And they controlled who got to run and when. Now, of course, that's pretty much dismantled. With the use of primaries, we've gotten rid of the party machine, although it does still exist in some form in Chicago. So there's less control over who gets to run, more ability for people to actually choose their candidates. So what we see today is more activity by the state and local parties in getting people registered to vote and getting people to run on the local and state levels. We need candidates for the Texas State Legislature, Railroad Commission, School Board, City Council, etc. So they do more of the local work. They're more connected to local politics. And in some states, the parties are stronger than others. Texas political parties, not that strong. Illinois political parties, pretty damn strong. It depends on the state, partially, as well. And in Chicago, for example, they actually had a system where basically the mayor of Chicago was a father, and then his son, and then his grandson. It was basically the Daley family around Chicago for like 50 years. It was ridiculous. Okay, so obviously parties are going to have some form of policy they can use to help people decide which way they want to vote. So again, this is broadly speaking. The Republican National Committee does tend to support strict immigration laws, more military spending, tax cuts, less spending on programs like welfare and Medicaid, and generally opposes both abortion and same-sex marriage. Now, again, this is broadly speaking. This doesn't apply to every Republican candidate or every Republican. Broadly speaking, the Democratic National Committee supports more funding for social programs, less spending for the military, more taxes on the wealthy, and stronger environmental protections. So based on policies, we see Democrats working to unite poor, minorities, young voters, and liberal professionals. Clinton, when he was running for office, tried to develop social programs that would get middle-class voters, tax stimulus, things like that. So Democrats try to reach out to a certain segment of voters. Republicans try to appeal to white working-class voters. Military families, they'll talk about their opposition to closing a military base, high spending for the military. And they also try to appeal to social and religious conservatives. And it was really during the Reagan administration that we saw Southern whites leave the Democratic Party and become Republican because of Reagan's support for prayer in school, his pro-life stance, and his opposition to affirmative action. But even though they go after certain parts of the voters, they do still try to create policies that will broadly appeal to the public. Tax cuts are pretty popular, so for Republicans, that's almost a no-brainer. Cut taxes, that'll make people happy. For Democrats, it's something like more spending on education, or let's take another look at marijuana laws, things like that. So they'll try to create policies that will appeal to the public at large, make as many people happy as they can, given, of course, the circumstances. Okay, any questions? Any questions online? Yes, Leslie, you can. Yeah, we can stay on here for a minute and talk. Yes. Okay. Okay. So what happens once they get into office, right? What happens when they actually win? In the House and the Senate, the majority party basically takes control. And the majority party is whichever party has the most seats in the House and the most seats in the Senate. So right now, Democrats hold the majority in the House, Republicans hold the majority in the Senate. And the leadership, which we'll talk about more when we get to the chapter on Congress, is chosen by the majority party. The Speaker of the House is basically chosen in a straight vote along party lines. So when Democrats regained control of the House in 2018, Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate are chosen by the party in charge. So currently the President pro tempore in the Senate is Mitch McConnell. That may change in November, as well as the Speaker of the House. Both parties are given a quota for the number of their members that can be on a committee. Usually it's a seniority system. The longer you've been in Congress, the better your committee assignment. A brand new Congress member isn't going to get on the Armed Services Committee. So if someone wants to transfer to a new committee or move up the ladder, it's up to the party leadership. And usually they will only give an advancement or a better seat to a member of their party who is facing a competitive re-election. So if you have a freshman Congress member who won but not by much in their district, they may get a better seat than someone who won with like a 60% margin. We do see that the Republicans have focused more on party building. The Democrats didn't do a good enough job of looking at that, which is partly why they lost in 2004. So when Howard Dean became the head of the DNC, he said we need to pay attention to building up our party, getting people more in line, etc. And because of the high issues with partisanship in Congress, unfortunately, the parties, the representatives will vote along party lines. If you look at the impeachment process for President Trump, there were no Republicans who voted yes in either chamber for impeachment or removal of President Trump. With the Affordable Care Act, it was basically almost every Democrat voting yes and almost every Republican voting no. So usually legislation is passed basically by the majority party, and that's the end of it. There's no real bipartisanship anymore. Okay, so how do people identify with the parties? It's fairly evenly split. We've got a little less than a third of Americans who identify as Republican, and about a third who identify as Democrat, and a little over a third who identify as independents. For the most part, once you've formed an attachment to a party, you're not necessarily going to leave. It takes something pretty significant. You have to feel like the party no longer meets your needs. So if you're a lifelong Republican, you're probably not going to become a Democrat unless you're looking at the current leadership and saying, this just doesn't work for me anymore. So it's not impossible, it's just rare for people to change their party loyalty, especially if they go from one to the other. Most votes are along partisan lines, especially on the down ticket races. If you don't know much about who's running for school board or state judiciary, you'll check out the party next to their name and you'll pick based on party. So it's not uncommon to see people in local races voting simply based on party because they don't know much about the candidates. And for die-hard members of the party, there is the option to do what's called straight ticket voting. You could walk in on election day and click a button that says vote all Republican, submit it and be done, or vote all Democrat, submit it and be done. So someone who will never cross party lines in an election will check that box and say, I'm voting for every Democrat or every Republican. For people who aren't super tied to the parties, they'll probably go through each election and pick the person they think is best. We also see party activists getting involved, people who give their time, their money, and their effort to the party. Democratic activists tend to be more liberal than Democratic voters. Republican activists tend to be more conservative than Republican voters. So that's part of the fracturing that we see, the polar opposites between staunch Democrats and staunch Republicans, where the majority of people are somewhere in the middle. For independents, it's going to depend on the election. 2016, a lot of them stayed home because they didn't like the candidates. We don't know if they'll show up this time around or not. One election they could vote Democrat, the next year Republican. They're really just going to vote based on whomever they think is the most qualified candidate. Okay, in terms of party affiliation, African Americans, more than 90% identify as Democrats. Part of this is because of President Johnson in the 1960s. African Americans originally identified as Republican because of Lincoln and the abolition movement, but in the 1960s, when President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and created Medicaid, they switched parties. So we saw African Americans becoming Democrats as opposed to Republicans. And so now they tend to overwhelmingly vote Democrat. Latino and Hispanic voters, as well as Asian Americans, are increasingly voting Democrat, partly because of some of the things that have been said by Donald Trump. You're not going to get people to necessarily want to vote for you if you say Mexico's sending us their rapists, druggies, etc. So we are seeing minorities tending to vote Democrat, though of course there are plenty of Latino, Hispanic voters who are Republican and who do support the Republican Party. Gender-wise, more often than, statistically speaking, women vote Democrat more often than men. Part of this is tied to issues. Women do care about issues like abortion, contraception, education, and childcare. Men may be more concerned with issues like defense spending, gun rights, the economy. So women do tend to vote Democrat more than men, but again, it's kind of a split group. Neither party can really take women voters for granted, or shouldn't take women voters for granted. Religiously speaking, about 90% of Jewish Americans identify as Democrat. I honestly don't know why that's the case. My best guess is because of presidents like FDR in World War II, but I honestly don't quite know why that's the case. Catholics lean Republican, although we do see a fair number of Catholics who do vote Democrat. I don't know if Joe Biden being Catholic will make a difference in how they vote this election. It's possible, but I don't think it would be fair to say that that would be the deciding factor. And we tend to see white and evangelical Protestants voting Republican, partly because the Republican Party has done a very good job of courting the white evangelical vote, especially with Mike Pence as vice president. Okay, in terms of some of the other demographics, affluent Americans vote Republican. This makes sense in some ways because they are the party of lower taxes and less spending. Working class whites tend to vote Republican as well. That's something that kind of baffles the researchers, but for whatever reason, they do tend to vote Republican as opposed to Democrat. Democrats do tend to get the working class minority votes instead. Ideologically, of course, conservatives are going to vote Republican, liberals are going to vote Democrat. Independents, of course, are going to split. One election they may go Republican, the next they could go Democrat. Just depends. But because people are moving away from that identity with the parties, it does make voting less predictable. Right now, I couldn't honestly tell you who's going to win in November. I think both candidates have a reasonable shot of winning. Because of independence, we can't necessarily say this person is very likely to win. The polls can sometimes be wrong. Independents could decide at the last minute not to vote. There's a variety of things that can change the outcome of the election. So it's not as easy to predict how it's going to go. In fact, it's become quite a bit harder because people are moving away from the party identity. A lot of Americans are tired of the party politics, of the refusal to work with each other. So they're moving away from that identity. Region-wise, the South does still tend to be largely Republican. There's a lot of military bases that support southern towns, and Republicans don't want to cut down military bases. The Northeast and the Northwest tend to be Democrat, considered a bit more liberal. States like Massachusetts, Colorado, Oregon are usually a little bit more liberal. And the Midwest is split. Minnesota and Illinois are pretty safe Democratic states. Missouri, Indiana, pretty safe Republican states, but states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa, Ohio, they change from one election to the next. So the Midwest, it's hard to know how it's going to go. We don't know which way Iowa's going to vote this year, or Ohio, or Pennsylvania. So they're kind of difficult to pin down. Age-wise, older voters do tend to vote Republican. Younger voters tend to vote Democrat. Again, we can't say, you know, everyone over the age of 50 is a Republican and everyone under the age of 50 is a Democrat, right? Because that's not the case. But we do tend to see a bit of a difference because of issues like Social Security, prescription drugs, and Medicare versus college tuition, housing, the economy, etc. So Americans are, I mean, there are divisions among party lines, but more people are breaking away from identifying with a party and more often than not voting based on who they think is the best candidate. So we can do polling and we can get somewhat of an idea of what's going to happen, but there's no 100% guarantee that we're going to know who will win in an election, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. If it's up in the air, people are more likely to show up to vote. If you say this is going to be a really close election, people have more incentive to show up. If you say Donald Trump's going to blow Joe Biden out of the water, well, then you won't vote. So it's not a bad thing that we're seeing less predictability. Okay, any questions? So quick informal poll, how many of you think Donald Trump is going to win re-election? How many of you think Biden might win? How many of you think, I have no idea, don't ask me? All right, fair enough. Yeah, I'm looking at the polls and I'm just like, I don't trust them. They were so wrong last time, and I don't know if they fixed the mistakes they made last year. So I think it's too close to call at this point. I don't know, Leslie. I think Biden has a good shot, but only if we can get young people and Democrats to the polls. He has to get them out to vote. Hillary didn't get young people to the polls, and she didn't energize Democrats. I think Biden's done a better job of that, but he has to get Democrats and young people out to the polls, otherwise he's not going to win. So I think it's a toss-up right now. I think either candidate could win. I don't think we'll know on election night who won because of mail-in ballots and all of that. But I think it's pretty evenly split right now. I think both President Trump and former Vice President Biden have a pretty equal shot of winning. I think it's too close to call. Another great question. I have no idea. Part of it is going to be counting the mail-in ballots, and then questions of if some of the mail-in ballots don't get there on or before election day, but it's because of a post office delay, do we count those votes or not? There may be court challenges. We may not know for a couple of weeks, to be honest. We may not have an answer for, I would say, at least a week, maybe longer. Because this is such special circumstances with COVID and everything. There's no way, I think there's almost no chance that we'll know on election night who won. Unless it's a runaway, but I don't think it's going to be a runaway. So I don't think we'll know for at least a week after. Which is scary, but this is kind of what we have to deal with. We're in the middle of a pandemic. So, who knows? Okay, any questions or comments from you guys? No? Okay, so just a reminder, your midterm exam is due tonight by 11:59 p.m. in Blackboard. If Blackboard is not working for some reason, you can email me your exam, but try to upload it through Blackboard. That way I have a good record of it being there. We will wrap up political parties next Tuesday. So read the second half of Chapter 9 for next Tuesday. And again, make sure I get your exam tonight by 11:59 p.m. If you have any questions over the weekend, you can email me or call or text my cell phone. I'll see you guys in person next Thursday, and I'll see some of you online on Tuesday.